Caddis Maximus here, this time with a quick review of the Harbor Freight 16-piece Forstner bit set. Forstner bits are used for making very precise holes in wood. That's why they oftentimes come in these types of sets with lots of increments. Usually you won't see increments like this unless it is twist drills. They're used for all sorts of functions, such as counterbore, where you want to drill a hole and then make another larger partial hole over the top, and then maybe put a bolt in and then put a piece of dowel over the top. This is one operation, but anytime you really want really nice, precise holes, and that's the whole purpose of these types of bits. Now these are like 37 bucks or something still. You can use a coupon, get some around 30 bucks, which is an unbelievable deal. These sets of like professional brands, such as like this Freud here, will be a couple $100 at least, and they make production grade versions of these that actually have carbide tips, and those can be $500 for a similar set. So a lot of people complain about some of the fit and finish of these Harbor Freights, but they are beyond. They are one of like the last few items the Harbor Freight is selling that really are just a huge price difference. They're cheaply made, but it's pretty unbelievable that for around $30 delivered from China, you can get 16 Forstner bits that will generally work. They are just a plain hard carbon steel, so they are hardened, but they are not any kind of grade of high-speed steel. They're not a tool steel, so this will last, probably a quarter to a third of the time or the amount of use as one of these Freud bits. To do a side-by-side, they kind of do something interesting here where they do sawtoothing, which is a lot more similar to what is known as self-feed bits, which are in many ways similar to a Forstner bit. But Forstner bits are made for precise holes. They also make flat-bottomed holes. They have two sweeps or two cutters on them and a very conservative point just to help them stay centered. Many times you'll use these bits in a drill press. They all have ground 5/16 stems or spindles, and so they're designed to really be used with collets. But of course you can use them with hand power tools, and that's what I use them for, is really not for precise hole drilling, precisely sized, but more for counterbore situations. Another thing I should note is Forstner bits are also designed to run slow. Many people burn them up running them way too fast. They really, even for small ones, all these Harbor Freight, surprisingly enough, I don't know if we can see it here, but actually have recommended RPMs, and on this 1 3/4 inch, it's 450 RPM. So really, these bits do need to run in low gear. One of the most common issues is they actually are designed to have a really, really fine, sharp edge. And versus a self-feed bit, even on these Harbor Freights, these side teeth here are also, they're not perfectly sharp, but they are very, very sharp, much sharper than on a self-feed bit, which is just designed for plowing a big hole through wood. On the Diablo, or this is the Freud, you can see that they have this kind of a similar idea, but that they do this weird kind of step grinding, but it maintains more of a full edge. We can also see that if we can get just the right angle, you can see that they use a very fine grit grinding wheel versus the very coarse grit here. You can just see the lines right along here, and if we get this in the right light, you can just see all these lines. So they ground them more quickly using a coarser wheel, which lasts longer and gets the job done quicker. So those are a lot of the aspects. Low-grade steel, not the best grinds, and you're getting a really good bit set, or a really reasonable bit set for the price. Now it's easier to grind the larger bits. We can see when we get to the smaller bits that the grinding doesn't go all the way to the center. It's getting kind of chowdery on the cutting edge of the smaller one, whatever this is. This is a 3/8 or something, 5/8. So on the small ones, they get particularly bad, but they still generally work. And that's why I was happy to pick up this set, because this is, oh, and I should mention that they had hardly any oil and they're starting to rust, and so you do want to keep these oiled. So for a Forstner bit set that really isn't going to last very long, basically for a cost of one of these for a professional grade version of one of these larger bits, you get a whole set. And if you find yourself always using the 1.5 inch Forstner bit, then when you burn up your Harbor Freight one, then you replace it with either a nice, professional grade one, or even a carbide tipped one that really will last a long time. Anyway, let me drill a couple of holes since I have 1 3/4 inch. Freud, and we'll see how it does. Actually, I just dug up one of these half-inch Freuds that I forgot I had. And so here's the difference between the Freud on the right and the Harbor Freight on the left. It's just a huge difference in manufacturing quality and the precision of grinding. It's really pretty surprising, to tell you the truth. And then the Freud uses a much higher grade steel. I don't know if they're high speed steel in the Freuds, but they last way longer than the Harbor Freights. But in this case, it's exactly what I was expected. A lot of people, there's been quite a few reviews of where there's just these horrible burrs, and some of these things wouldn't cut because all the cutting edges where they had misground them to the point to where it was actually dull. And in this particular set, they've actually been pretty decent. I guess enough people returned enough sets for Harbor Freight to say, hey guys, you gotta at least sharpen them well enough for them to cut. Okay, here's my famous block of Douglas fir. If you have trypophobia, you should probably look away now. That's the fear of holes. And this block, when I originally got it, was unholy, but I've exercised its sin through the judicious use of power tools. One of the parts of the accuracy of Forstner bits, and I forgot to mention that, and I do have a subscriber who does use these and has commented about them, is this grinding. They are very true. Forstner bits are supposed to run very, very straight. Essentially like an end mill in a milling machine or a good drill bit. So if you ever have a Forstner that wobbles around, you really not, can ruin the cuts. They're also good when you have a good Forstner like a Freud, is if you think that maybe you have a bent drill chuck. A Forstner bit is something that is going to be really straight because they grind it extremely straight. And chuck that up and see if the Forstner bit wobbles around. Let's start off with the Harbor Freight, and indeed I am running this at 450 RPM out of this brushless cordless drill. They don't self-feed, so if you're using these by hand, you do need to apply pressure, and you need to be aware of that. And then they grab. They're really not meant to be run by hand unless you need to or you have experience doing it. There we go. Let me do the Freud. Actually, let me run this first hole just a little deeper. One of the tips by hand is when people run hole saws, or not so much self-feed bit, but particularly hole saws, bits that you have to press down on, you get this habit of wanting to rock it around in order to get it to cut more quickly. If you're using a Forstner bit by hand, you have to resist that. You just have to deal with trying to press down absolutely straight and just use raw force to get it to cut. That's the only way you're going to get any semblance of an accurate hole with a Forstner bit by hand. Now with the Freud Austrian made bit, same size, 1 3/4 inch. There was a much better grind on that Freud. You could just see I was pressing down on that Harbor Freight with quite a bit of force, and this Freud did what it was supposed to, cut really nicely, and I shouldn't have had to use so much force. That means that the angles, the geometry in the Harbor Freight are particularly bad. All right, here we are. There's a tiny bit of the cap. There. Anyway. So what we have is our two holes, one with the Harbor Freight and one with the Freud. Just to take a quick look, here's what some of the chips from the Freud. They were actually nice and thick, real consistent, and you could tell by the way they were cutting. Really pretty nice bit. The chips from the Harbor Freight were real wispy because it was just not taking a very aggressive cut, and I had to press pretty hard. You can tell it is still cutting because it's making curled bits, but they're just all real thin. Interestingly enough, since the Harbor Freight wasn't cutting as well, the bore of the hole, and I don't know if I can get this on camera, we can zoom in as much as possible, but it's really smooth. I mean, if we compare to any of these other holes I've been making with augers and various other bits, you can see the purpose of the Forstner. It makes a very nice hole. And on this Harbor Freight, surprisingly enough, the walls are very good. That geometry is terrible for drilling and makes it heat up real fast, but it sure does make a nice wall. The bottom is okay. I think it's pretty decent. Now here's the Freud. And the Freud did pretty well. Right here where it's cross-cutting, it did get a little rough, but there is a bit of a difference in grain, so I will write it off. This area here is just, and down here is absolutely excellent. The finish of the bottom of the hole is pretty good. It got a little interesting on this side, but it could be the grain. But it really feels pretty smooth. On the Harbor Freight, it is a little rougher. Definitely is a bit rougher on the bottom of the hole. So, kind of a lesson. You do get what you pay for. The Diablo does cut more properly. Has much better geometry, but you're going to pay a whole heck of a lot more than these Harbor Freights. And I think these Harbor Freights are great. The issue also is buying these Harbor Freights and having a local tool shop resharpen them. It depends on how much that costs, but they are a low grade of steel, and so you'll oftentimes, if you're using these, be pulling them out or checking them to make sure that they're not getting too hot, because as soon as you get them too hot, it'll ruin the temper on these Harbor Freights, and then they'll die in an instant after that. That's one of the deals with higher grade steels, is that they can take more heat and maintain their hardness. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.